Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Deeran. I'm Director of Reform Scotland, and welcome to today's discussion with Professor Graeme Roy, Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. I regard Graeme as one of the most significant and important figures in public life in Scotland. I think under his leadership, the Fiscal Commission provides an essential public service looking under the bonnet of the Scottish economy and at the government's performance, as well as casting an eye to the future and letting us know what we might be expected to hold. It explains very well the costs of decisions that are taken and, importantly, of those not taken. And it's not afraid to speak truth to power based on hard data and evidence. I think we should all be glad that the Commission exists. I should also say, though, that I tend to read the Commission's reports through my fingers these days. They really ring with optimism as they examine the issues and challenges that face the nation. The most recent publication was certainly no different. The Fiscal Sustainability Report that emerged a few weeks ago looked forward over the next 50 years and discussed the links between health, demographic shifts, and the public finances. It certainly gave me a lot to think about, and I thought that it would be useful to hear from Graeme about this report's findings in a bit of detail. So what we're going to do is Graeme's going to do a bit of a presentation. He has some slides, as he always does. So I'm going to hand over to him, and then we'll have a bit of a chat afterwards, and we'll also take questions from the audience. So you can send these through using the chat function on your Zoom screen. Can I just check that everyone's muted themselves apart from Graeme and me, so there's no background distractions? And with that, I'll hand over to you, Graeme.
Brilliant, excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. And it's a great pleasure to come along and chat with everyone about our report today. What I'll do is I'm just going to load up the slides, and can I just check that everyone can see these slides? Has everyone got them okay? Is that all right,
It's doing
Chris?
the other thing now, the wrong thing rather
Is
than
it
the
showing the?
yeah, the full screen. That's it. That's it.
Is it
Oh,
all
that
right?
was it.
Okay, sorry. Let's start again. Um, are you seeing the full slides okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Excellent. There's always that nervous bit when you do the technology to see if it works okay. So as I said, thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot for the chance to come along and chat with you about today. I promise it's not going to be death by PowerPoint. I've just got a few pictures just to show people and to frame the conversation, and really good to get questions and thoughts as we go. Just before we start, Chris, what I was going to maybe suggest, if it's okay, is just to give a bit of overview about who we are and what the Fiscal Commission does, just for people who don't know who we are. So we're Scotland's official independent fiscal institution, and what that means is that we do various pieces of work to support the Scottish budget process and to be independent in that budget process. So we forecast the government's taxes and social security commitments, but we also do kind of some scrutiny and insights and assessments of overall spending commitments, the direction of travel within the Scottish budget to hopefully help inform scrutiny of the budget and broader public debate. But what we also do increasingly over the last few years is to look beyond the short term and what's happening in the next year's budget and the like, to be much more expansive about what are some of the big long term issues that we think will have an impact not just on the Scottish budget in the near term, but on future Scottish budgets in the years and decades to come. Because a large part of what we would argue is that there's some big trends in society and the economy that will have a really quite dramatic impact upon Scotland's public finances. And that includes things like climate change, whether that be the investment we need to make in net zero and what are the implications for that for the public finances, what might be the effects of adapting and responding to the damage of climate change, how might that impact upon the budget, but also looking at things which I'll discuss today about our demographics and the health of our population and how might they have an impact on Scotland's public finances. And we can obviously see some of the issues that we are dealing with at the moment in terms of challenges within the budget around the NHS and demand, etc., and a large part of that coming through the changing nature of our population. So, as Chris said, last month we published our latest fiscal sustainability report, which essentially looks at the long-term trend in Scotland's public finances and then asks questions about, well, what happens if we think about how our demographics are going to change? What happens if we think about how our health is going to change, and how might that have an impact upon the budget allocations for the Scottish Government or future Scottish governments in the years to come. So what we do in our report is, as I said, this one is that we focus very much on the demographic outlook for Scotland, and we essentially start to think about, well, what might this mean for the Scottish budget? And what this chart here is just taken from our report, where we are using the projections from the Office for National Statistics, and looking at what the trajectory might be for Scotland's population over the next few decades. Now, one thing I should caveat this with is that for people who know the world of economic forecasting, then you might ask the question about, well, how can you project over such a long period of time when you struggle to potentially forecast in the near term because it's so uncertain? In many ways, I think that one of the things that's quite important about this work is that in many ways we're not trying to do point estimates. We're just trying to highlight big trends and then show how these trends are going to impact on the public finances over the long term. So in many ways we can be pretty confident about some of the big headline outcomes that we're going to see and what that means for the public finances. So just looking at our demographics, what are the trends that we're likely to see in our demographics for Scotland, and crucially how they compare to the UK, and then what that might mean for our public finances. And this chart here, so if we look at the left-hand side there first, there's a couple of really important things that I think are quite useful to highlight. So the first thing is clearly the significant growth that we're going to have over the next few decades in the elderly population, so people aged 85 and above, people aged 75 and above. And you're looking at over the next 25 years or so, an increase, a doubling of the population of people who are aged 85 and over in Scotland. And in contrast, if you look at what's traditionally been our working age population in Scotland, that's pretty much projected to be relatively flat, if not to decline over the next few decades. And why does that matter for the public finances? Well, it matters because we know that as we get older, then it's more likely that we're going to demand healthcare, social care, as you know, the probability of illness, the probability of having needing to have procedures, whether that be on replacement hips, knees, prevalence of disease, they all are highly correlated with age. So all else remaining equal, as the population averages an increase in its age, that's actually going to put more spending commitments on healthcare. At the same time, we also know that essentially the tax pool will not be as potentially rich as it has been historically in the past, because there's going to be fewer people working here, and that's two effects are going to have quite a significant implication for our public finances. And the first point I would make in all of that is that Scotland is not unique in facing this challenge. I mean, you look around most high-income economies around the world, and we face an exactly same challenge of an aging population and a declining or relatively flat working age population. And you see that there on the right-hand side with the UK. And you see a similar trend of a rising in the age of the population, and also a relatively flatlining in terms of the working age population. So this isn't unique to Scotland. This is a shared challenge that everybody faces. The implication, though, for devolved services and public spending choices is that this isn't a challenge that we could ignore just because everyone's facing the challenge. It will be on the onus on policymakers and politicians in Scotland to essentially respond to these challenges and to think about how we deliver public services, think about how we reform public services, think about how we prioritise public services when you face these trends. And as I said, you can play around with some of the assumptions. You can think that there might be different assumptions on how our demographics might go, but these trends are pretty much baked into our population base. The second thing I want to make and why this really matters from a public finance point of view, particularly over the next 25 years or so. And you might be able to detect it there from that graph, but I'll show you a graph that hope in a second that hopefully makes it easier. Is that one thing that we see in Scotland's demographic kind of base is that Scotland's population is likely to age earlier than in the rest of the UK. So we're aging, the UK is aging, Scotland is aging. But if you look at the steepness of the green and the purple lines there, they're steeper in Scotland over the next 25 years than they are in the rest of the UK. And that's perhaps actually easier to see if you look at this chart here, where what I've got here is Scotland's share of the UK population for different elements of different age profiles. And you see that particularly the next 25 years, our share of people who are aged 85 and over, 75 and over, is going to increase over the next 25 years. And that's this trend that Scotland's population is aging earlier than the rest of the UK. And that actually reflects decades of how Scotland's population has evolved over the years, where we've had less migration into Scotland. We've had a lower birth rate, so that's baked into our population. So it means that essentially the bulge of the population coming through is going to essentially accelerate over the next few years. And again, why does that matter from a Scottish perspective? Well, and a public finance perspective, it means that the challenge is going to be particularly acute over the next 25 years because we've got this relatively accelerating age profile of our population compared to the rest of the UK. So the UK faces this challenge, but it's going to be more acute in Scotland over the next 25 years or so. So there's going to be an even bigger kind of balancing act to be made. The second thing, without getting into the detail, we might come on to this in the questions around public finances and how Scotland receives its money. But a crucial element of how Scotland receives its money is obviously through the Barnett formula, which allocates Scotland a population share of equivalent spending in England. And clearly, if England is spending more money, if the UK government are spending more money on health-related expenditures, then Scotland gets a Barnett consequential of that. But a Barnett consequential will typically be a per capita share of that spending. But if we've got a higher proportion in a per capita share of elderly population, then the funding flowing into that is not going to be like for like in terms of the spending commitments. And that's the kind of first kind of nuance when we start to think about how Scotland receives its money, how the Scottish Government raises its funding, where the age profile isn't just on the spending side, but it also is on the funding side as well, and how the money comes through. And of course, again, thinking about the other aspect of funding, which is related to taxation, clearly our ability to raise tax revenues depends on the proportion of our working age population. And again, any pressures there are likely to make that perhaps a bit more acute in Scotland in the immediate period, the next 25 years or so. So quite a lot of the chat we've had about kind of long-term fiscal sustainability and the shift to prevention and all these things we've spoken about for the last decade. And I think what we're highlighting here is that this is going to essentially really start to crystallize. In fact, it's already crystallizing in some of the pressures on public services, but it's going to be particularly acute over the next starting in the next parliament, but in the next couple of parliamentary terms. This is going to be a real challenge facing all policymakers and all politicians. So again, this isn't just something unique to the current Scottish Government, but anyone who holds ambitions of running the next and future Scottish Government is going to be a big challenge. So that's going to be a big issue, and I'll talk a bit about what does that mean for our public finances at the end when we look at the overall numbers. But clearly, within all of this, how demographics lead through to the public finances, the key element is, well, what does this mean for health spending, and what is going to happen to health over time? So health, the largest component of the Scottish Government's budget, we think that's going to continue to increase as the population ages, and more is going into support the healthcare of society. So clearly the aging of the population is fundamental in this. And a good example of that we talk about in the report is that if you look at average health spending for someone aged between about 16 to 60, that's around about between about £2,000 to £4,000 per year of someone in that core age bracket. Once you get above, say, 85, the average spend is closer to £14,000 a year. So clearly, it's largely arithmetic. As you have more people who are elderly, then the cost to the NHS from a public finance point of view is going to be that much higher, and therefore it has to be paid for. So aging population is the first element, but let's be clear, the fact that we're aging is a great success story in society. It's going to have implications for our public services, but it's a general challenge that we're going to face, and we can't really do much about that. Where we can do something about, and this is what we talk about in a report, is to look at the other areas that are driving demand in healthcare and what are the pressures in all of that. And there's some elements within the health system, and I know Reform Scotland have done quite a bit of work into this about looking at some of the drivers of what dictates health spending within the country. And some of that is that it's actually quite difficult to manage costs and manage demand within the health system, in part because as we get wealthy as a country, then we typically want to demand more from healthcare services as the economy grows and as wages rise, that puts cost pressures onto the NHS. There are also some real challenges in actually saving money within the health sector. That's not to say we can't do it, but if you think about it relative to other parts of the economy, because we rely so much on care and individuals and employees to provide that health care, it's not always automatic that you can have the same efficiency savings that you would do elsewhere. There's also lots of evidence about, growth in long-term health conditions and the prevalence of that. So Public Health Scotland have done a lot of work about burden of disease and potential pressures that are coming down the line. And also challenges around the fact that technology, we often hope that technology is going to be the key thing that can help us navigate some of these challenges. And there are definitely ways that technology can help and can help improve outcomes and lead to efficiencies. But a lot of the time in the health system, technological improvements can actually lead to higher costs. So you can detect illnesses quicker, which then has on costs further down the line because of new sophisticated treatments and drugs can be developed, but they are really expensive. So there's really challenges about how we manage those pressures within the system. Now, we can talk maybe a bit about how those can be done, but what we focus on in our report is saying, well, the one area that we can really look at and we can make a difference in is the underlying health of our population. And what can we do to improve the health of Scotland's population? Because clearly, as we age, spending in the health service is going to grow over time. But if essentially we can reduce that spending on people as we age, then that's actually going to be, from a fiscal perspective, something that is going to be that's going to save money and is going to be really positive. And improving the health of the population doesn't just lead to less spending over time on health, it also improves participation. It improves the economy, which in turn improves tax revenues. It reduces demand on things like social care, on disability payments, which in turn all make fiscal savings. So essentially, if you can reduce the amount that is spent because the population is becoming healthier, that can be a key way to help improve the public finances. And again, we can see areas where you can make progress. So we know that Scotland's healthy life expectancy lags behind England by a couple of years. We know that, healthy life expectancy or healthy living can vary up to maybe 25 years between the most deprived and the least deprived areas of Scotland. And what we do is trying to say is, okay, we talk a lot about improving the health of the population. We talk about ways that you can do it. What's the potential fiscal payoff that we can have from improving Scotland's health over time? And that brings us all to, I guess, our kind of key conclusions at the end about what do we essentially conclude from the overall analysis that we've done. And when we put all of that together, the demographics and the health and the way that the Scottish Government's model of budgeting works, we see that consistently over the next few years and on a consistent basis, building over time through the decades, there's going to be a growing gap between funding and spending commitments that the government are making. So essentially trying to maintain the status quo isn't going to be an option. There's going to be a gap emerging between funding and spending, and therefore the government is going to have to either cut spending or it's going to have to increase taxation. And to give you an example just of the scale of this, just to give you an overview about how much of a systemic risk that this is and how significant it is, the main central scenario where we look at the specific conditions in Scotland and we look at how the UK government might potentially manage these sorts of risks and the implications for funding to the Scottish government, we are talking about a potential gap between funding and spending on average of about 11% over the 50-year projection. That's something that builds up over time. So it's something that you will see gradually kicking in, but it will start to come up to really quite significant changes within how we manage our public finances in Scotland. And we talk about how in the report, well, actually, one way we can help solve this from a fiscal perspective is that if we can actually improve health outcomes, so we can do what we've talking about all those years about moving into prevention, about improving the healthy life expectancy of people, these can actually lead to material savings, both in terms of spending, but also improvements in tax revenues that can actually ultimately lead to quite significant fiscal savings over time. It's not going to be the panacea, it's not going to solve absolutely everything. There will still be a gap, which will require really difficult decisions by government to scale back in some key areas, but it will actually be significant to make a significant, substantial progress to tackling some of the long-term fiscal constraints and the budget gap that we see emerging in Scotland over time. And with that, Chris, if that's okay, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing and more than happy to pick up questions and comments as we go.
Thank you very much for that, Graeme. I think probably you can see why the report seized my attention as dramatically as it did. Please do start sending your questions through in the chat, and we'll put them to Graeme shortly. I just wanted to start on the demographic side of things, Graeme. I think I'm right in saying that previously it was thought that the Scottish population was going to shrink over coming decades, but your report has now projects that it's actually going to rise. Could you tell us a bit about the data?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So the one is our population is essentially made up of what happened to our population is largely made up of the stock of our population, and then the difference between births and deaths, and then migration. And actually, the stock of our population and all the projections that the demographers make around births and deaths haven't really changed. That essentially the deaths are likely to be bigger than exceed births, on a consistent period going forward. Our replacement ratio is not anything that's going to turn that around. Where the dynamic kicks in is what the assumptions are being made about migration. So, and what's happened across the UK is a quite a significant revision upwards in what people think might be migration coming into the country. Now, this is where it gets quite interesting in the sense that this is made by kind of people like me sitting thinking about how migration might evolve and looking at past trends, and that's why the ONS have uplifted their projections for migration, which stands in contrast to actually where the political narrative is, which is actually trying to bear down on migration. So one of the things we highlight in our report is that potentially, we've put through what the demographers are saying might happen to migration based on the most recent trends, that will continue to rise. But actually, it might be an area where policy might intervene and actually lead to lower migration. And that then has potential additional implications for Scotland and its public finances.
And what would your view be of the impact of migration on the fiscal situation? Obviously, you'd presume it would be younger people of working age that would be moving to the country. There are arguments around just how much the impact on economic growth, how much pressure they add on public services, housing, etc. Have you got a sort of a view of? It's obviously not a silver bullet, but would your view be it would largely be a positive thing to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. I think from an economic perspective, yeah, I mean, if you can get, migrants that are making a positive contribution to the economy, that are then skilled and then adding to the value of the workforce, all the evidence suggests that is good for an economy. The implications of the public finances are a bit more nuanced because you have additional migration, that's additional demand on public services. We've also got this slightly weird thing where the nature of our fiscal framework, you probably remember when the fiscal framework was being set up, there was real concerns about Scotland's kind of weaker population potentially impacting on our relative performance of tax revenue. So what the two governments agreed to was essentially a model where it compares tax performance per head, and that's the kind of underlying tax equation in our budget. So in some ways, more migration doesn't really we don't get the benefit of that because of the nature of the framework. Well, because it's tax receipts per head. So you get more people coming in, you get more tax revenues, but you also have more people per head, and therefore that works to counterbalance that. So under the framework we've got, we don't actually get the same benefits that say another country, a country doesn't have our fiscal framework would get from migration coming in, and that's just a quirk of the fiscal framework that we have.
Right. One of the other things that struck me in your report was a fairly dramatic drop in Scotland's share of the UK population
Yeah.
over the coming years. And I wonder if you could sort of maybe explain that and also the consequences of that for our, I guess, the fiscal framework and the rest.
Yeah, so this is actually a fascinating trend that's been going on for a very long time. I mean, you go back to 20th century, start of the 20th century, and Scotland has a much bigger share of the UK population, and it's gradually declined and continued to decline. And a lot of that is the kind of the weak population growth and the flatlining of our population in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the large volumes of people that left Scotland during that time, the net outflows of people. That's then baked into our baseline, which then means as that is just as we get, as you get older, you have a lower replacement ratio, and so the effects of that come round. So the thing about demographics is it's very much like an oil tanker. Something that happens maybe 50 years ago can still be having an impact today. So we're still seeing the effects of that kind of, you know, decrease in Scotland's population a long time ago feeding through here. We also have a slightly lower birth rate than in the rest of the UK. And also, even despite we've uplifted and taken a demography review about higher migration, we have a lower share of international migration coming into the UK than our population share. So there's more migration going into the rest of the UK than is going into Scotland. And all of those factors just mean that Scotland's share of the UK population is projected to fall. And that does have some, I guess, some areas of where that makes a difference. So it clearly has an impact on the amount coming through the Barnett formula, I guess, is less because our share is going down. We are protected slightly, as I said, on the tax revenue side of things, but it does have implication for things like universities and education because we're going to have a smaller share of the UK population of young people. So in areas where we might be making a fiscal saving, that's actually going to have potential implications for how we deliver public services because actually some areas we're going to see, and particularly in rural parts of Scotland, we're going to see population decline, and that will have its own effects on public services. On some areas like health, it's going to be increased demand and how you manage that. In other areas such as rural schools, rural roads, rural communities, it's going to be about how do you manage reduced demand and how do you keep public services going in that sort of community.
Yeah. Moving maybe on to the health side of things, you touched on health inequalities, which are, I think, steeper in Scotland than they are certainly in England. Healthy life expectancy is shorter. And I just wonder, have you got any of that data at your fingertips about just, because that was quite dramatic as well. I
Yeah.
spoke to you before about this.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at like in the kind of the kind of most deprived areas in Scotland relative to the least deprived areas, you're talking about potentially like a healthy life. So when actually people not reporting that they're suffering from different health issues of up to 25 years. And that has, from a public finance point of view, I mean, clearly that's a huge issue for individuals and society, etc., and communities they're in. From a public finance point of view, particularly under the fact we now have tax powers, that has major fiscal implications because it means that that's people not in the labour force paying taxes, which now flow to the Scottish Government. It means potentially additional demand on healthcare services. We might come on to this, but the big increase in disability payments that are now embedded into the Scottish budget, which again Scottish Government is committed to funding and paying for. So that leads to an additional payment that needs to go as well. And all of these things add up to quite a significant fiscal cost. So, and I guess the point we're trying to make is that it's not about saying that you're going to change entitlement or change policy in a sense, but if you can reduce that inflow, if you can, encourage people to be remaining more in work, that has quite a significant fiscal payoff over time.
Um, and some of the projections in your report, again, that caught the attention was that I think by 2029, 30, health is expected to take up 34% of the annual Scottish Government budget and grow to 47% by 2074,
Yeah.
75, which is obviously vast. And the consequences for other budgets, other public services don't really need to be spelled out, I guess. And that takes us on to another point you made about moving towards maybe more preventative work in healthcare. And we've been talking about this for an awful long time. Everyone talks about the Christie principles and the rest of it, but governments seem to, well, they get a lot of glory for increasing spending relentlessly on the NHS, but actually, arguably, to start tackling some of these things, money has to be spent before that point. It's that, rather than when people are sick, it's to try and stop them getting sick in the first place. A very difficult thing for politicians to do, because inevitably you've then got to say, well, I'm taking money from this vital public service to try and, somewhere down the line, if we spend it here, we might see an improvement. What's your sort of read on that?
I mean, you're right. And I guess probably one of the frustration for us, all of us who've been around this debate for a long time about, we've talked about prevention. We know it, we know we need to do it. We know we need to think about better evaluation and appraisal of our policy choices. But actually, it's dead easy to slip into one-year budgets and just kind of pushing money around. And your point about more money going into health, and we're seeing that. We're seeing, if you look at the relative share of the budget that's now in health, you look at the relative share of the budget that's now in social security, that's all being paid for by, essentially other areas picking up more heavy lifting, whether it be education, local government, economic development, all of those areas are doing it. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, there's almost a bit about, I think, going back to Christie, the language is always about this is coming, we need to get ready for it. Actually, what we see when we look at the numbers now is we're here. Like this is happening. Our population is now aged, and it's aging rapidly over the next 25 years. So this will hit the next parliament. Whoever makes up the government, it will hit the parliament after that. And they'll be the ones responsible for essentially having to make cuts in other areas in order to respond, to put more money into the fact that our population is aging. And I guess one of the things which I don't think we've done very well, and include people like ourselves in this as well, is that the presumption is that when we talk about making cuts or making changes, it's as though it's from the current status quo, and we say, yes, we're having to take money from health in order to put into housing, or we're having to reprioritize money in one area to support that, as though that is what's going to continue over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But as our analysis shows, that is not what's going to happen. Essentially, in order to continue to pay for just the same standard of healthcare we have at the moment, you are actually going to have to make cuts elsewhere. So it's about reframing what is the status quo, and just this assumption that what we've got just now will always continue into the future. What our analysis says is, no, that's not right. If you don't do anything now, you're going to be making cuts repeatedly in the years to come. So the status quo is not the outcome you should be comparing yourself to. You should be thinking about what is coming down the line and how you adjust to that.
And you mentioned in your presentation the sort of worst case scenario that you've looked at if this stuff isn't done and changes aren't made. And you talked about, I think, an annual budget gap of 11% by the time it gets, but that's equivalent to £14 billion a year.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge. I mean, this is this, and this is. And as I said, some of the health stuff will help you tackle that. But it's not going to get all the way. And this is where, again, it's not just a conversation about prevention. It's really a conversation about what do we prioritize as a country in terms of the public services. And again, a lot of this is arithmetic. I mean, you go back to the 70s, and you had double the number of young people, so at school age relative to the people who are retirement age. The most recent census has 250,000 more people of retirement age than young people. I mean, it's just that their public services were set up for when you had a pyramid structure of your population, where you have a large number of people in work, paying taxes for a relatively small number of people who are older and demanding and needing services. Whereas that is going to change. You're going to have a smaller pool of working age people and a bigger pool of people that are going to be demanding more and needing more support in healthcare. And that's going to have to be difficult decisions about what we prioritize, how we pay for things, and how efficient we are at delivering services.
And I suppose, you know, if you look across the Atlantic at the Doge and the Scottish Government has its own small version of that Ivan McKee's pushing through a sort of public sector efficiency programme where they're looking to streamline quangos and cut the property footprint that the government has, trying to use the purchasing power of the public sector to bring down procurement costs. You know, I suspect that that won't even touch the sides of the challenge that we're facing. So I think it would be interesting to get a sense from you and I know you're limited in what you can say, but how radical do our politicians need to be? As you rightly say, the status quo isn't sustainable. It still feels like we're living in a world where the political message in Scotland, at least, is that it is sustainable. We're
Mhm.
still committing to higher public spending, you know, more universalism and the rest of it. What's your sort of analysis of where the politicians are? I'm not saying any one minister or any other minister
Yeah.
or opposition person, but and how radical they will need to be.
Yeah. And so I think, I mean, you're right. I think everything helps. So things like becoming more efficient, things like improving health. There will be a debate about what you prioritize. There will be a debate about taxing and how you fund all of that. And that's not just, I said that these are not just debates that are unique to Scotland. These are debates that are taking place around the world. I mean, I do think, I mean, this is not a criticism of any kind of one political party or even the current government or politicians, but I, I I don't get the sense that the full appreciation of the scale of the challenge that is coming and actually what this will mean for essentially the ability to deliver core public services. I mean, these are big numbers that are projected to kick in over a relatively short period of time. I was talking about the next parliament and the parliament after that. And we've seen some kind of attempts at this. The government have started to talk about a medium-term financial strategy, that one due later this kind of spring summer. There's we've done our fiscal sustainability report. There was a debate in Parliament about it, and I must say that actually, to be honest, the Finance Committee have been really good on this. They've been really engaged, but I don't know how engaged other committees are. I don't know how others out there seem very much it's still in that short term focus rather than these big long term issues. And there was a debate in Parliament around it. So it seems like we're making baby steps to it. And I guess our point is that you really need to this is really big kind of fiscal challenges that really need to be taken head on now. And because the point is that doing nothing is not a decision, because if you do nothing, as our charts kind of show, you're essentially going to be cutting spending consistently in key areas in order to essentially maintain the status quo in the health system because of the rise in demand that you face.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for that. I'll just move on to some questions now from the audience, and if I say your name, if you'd be willing to just read out your question. The first one is from Michael Picken. Michael, are you able to ask your question? You with us, Michael? Um, okay. Well, Michael asks, how are projections of inward-outward migration of younger and older people affected by Brexit?
hmm Yeah, so this is one of the things that is quite. I said we rely on our demographers and the ONS to produce this thing, and what you see is actually the trend since Brexit has actually been to higher migration coming into the UK, and that's why the projections have been updated. Um, but clearly, over the long term, if politicians have an objective to essentially reduce migration, so Brexit was obviously dominated by migration. We've had migration. What we've had since then is a displacement about where migration has come from. But if they continue to have a policy agenda to essentially reduce migration, then that will have an impact on Scotland's economy and outlook. The bit about Brexit, I think, is more subtle in that what we've seen really is some kind of pockets of kind of significant falling off in some key areas within our economy. So particular sectors of our economy that relied on, say, for example, temporary migrant labour coming in, things like agriculture, etc. That's had a really dramatic impact on that. Similar in things like students, for example, again, universities being impacted by a fall off, quite a significant fall off in EU students in there. So that's the kind of they're more targeted, smaller events that you've seen Brexit having an impact in there. And again, the conclusion of that is that it's just bad for the economy because these are potential people who are coming in the sweet spot of migration in the sense that they're coming in to potentially earn money and then less demand in public services because they're younger, and then hopefully you build that over time. And that's just one of the challenges that Brexit's created.
Okay. Bill McCall.
Hi, Graeme. Thanks very much indeed. I hesitate to say thank you, Graeme, as ever. The messenger always bringing the news. My question really is a specific on the Barnett formula.
Yeah.
We know that the calculation is based on old data, population percentages. Have you risked that normalising to today's position or becoming a dynamic measure at all?
So the population estimates now the population figures in Barnet now get updated. So it was the case for many years that we had a declining population, but we're still getting
the higher number.
The higher number, yeah. And then there was the thing called the Portillo adjustment, where
Yeah, I
Michael
remember
Portillo rumbled us and found out that Scotland was getting a higher share. And so now they regularly adjust the population number. So we get, if our population declines, we get a lower share of that. We get a lower share of that over time. So the population bit there is adjusted for that. So part of our remit is that we always just take the status quo as given and we take the fiscal framework as given and we don't play around with that. Where I think it matters on things like for our work here is that chart I showed you where we have a relatively high proportion of the UK population and growing of elderly people, so above 85 and above 75.
Yep.
What we'll be doing is only getting a Barnett consequential, which would be less than that. So clearly that doesn't add up, and we have to find additional revenues that kick in there. And I mean, it's a quite interesting. There's a broader question which I think it's quite interesting in that the fiscal framework was never really discussed or set up about how you would manage fiscal sustainability over the long term. It was another political fix.
Yeah.
Where the governments got together, came up with what they could agree, and it was done and dusted. But I think this broadening out your question and actually looking at how does the fiscal framework work over the long term when you've got potential variations between Scotland and the UK in terms of some of the challenges it faced, also some of the opportunities that we faced last year. We looked at net zero, and you can see some additional investment opportunities that might not exist in the UK, but the fiscal framework is completely neutral to all of that, so it leads to perhaps some slightly odd outcomes.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if there's a sort of review somewhere on the horizon to make it more dynamic and more up to date for the very things that you've mentioned. Because if there was any tension, let's say political tension between the two parliaments in the future, I could see it very quickly becoming a pinch point, perhaps.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. And the bit that's never been discussed in the Barnett formula is the baseline.
Yeah.
And the fact that the fact that we have a higher starting point of spending per head relative to the UK. But certainly, thankfully, that's somewhere I do not have to go anywhere near.
Thanks very much, Bill. Graeme Blackett.
Thanks, Graeme. I remember you saying something a few years ago about long-term trends, and it was something along the lines of if you take any trend and project it forward far enough into the future, it eventually gets to the point where it's impossible and something has to change. And clearly, the report identifies improved health as one of the things that would need to change. It seems to me the other obvious thing would be to extend working lives. The idea that we can expect retirement to last several decades is a really recent thing. And I was wondering whether the Commission had done or was planning any work that would look at the potential impact of extending working lives.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So we do in the report adjust for the changes in pension age that are projected to come in. So you do see uplifts in the economy from the fact that you're changing the pension age, etc., you extend the working lives, etc. That improves the tax revenues, etc. And that can be it can be a temporary fix. It boosts it, but it doesn't fully address it. I think the broader point you're making, I think, is entirely right. Is that again one of the things that we need to think about, and this is again not unique to Scotland, but how do you essentially extend people working into the labour force, well beyond the traditional 16 to 64, 16 to 65 working age profile. And that could be about, maybe thinking about more flexible working. It could be about how you support training as people move through their working life, particularly with things like the advent of digital and AI going to disrupt the labour market even more. And potentially, how do you have greater kind of options for people to be, managing caring responsibilities alongside, kind of the working commitments that they might have as they go through. So that's clearly an area which, kind of needs to be looked at and potentially a focus. And it's one of these things that helps at the margin, but it's going to be something which is not not a kind of a silver bullet. And it's very difficult. I mean, you probably saw a couple of years ago the challenges in France when they tried to change state pension age, and the tractors were out everywhere, and it was all a bit of a disaster. But so these are real challenges that are not just unique to Scotland.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Graeme. Alex Stobart.
Hello, Graeme. Thanks very much. And my question was for Scotland, with these challenges and the ongoing fall in productivity across public services, how and when do you think voters, investors, and the politicians will react?
And I think, Graeme, that sort of touches a bit on my last question to you, but Alex has put it better because I asked really about politicians, but he's talking about also voters and investors, which are the kind of people that will bring pressure that forces the politicians to act if they won't off their own bat.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so one of the things which again we kind of talk about in our report is that this is almost like this is one of the challenges with this is it's a bit of a slow burn, because it's basically what you see is these pressures building year on year. So it's not something like the COVID shock to public services or a recession or something like that to revenues where you can look at it very quickly and go, oh, we're having to make big cuts or we're having to increase taxation to respond to this. And therefore, yeah, we can see it, we can really identify it and we can respond. This is something which, again, what we're saying is that actually it's the sort of thing that just builds up. And it will only be once you start to look back and you see, well, hold on a minute, what's happened to other budgets? What's happened to other commitments? What's happened to taxation as we keep on potentially adding to it? So I don't know whether there'll be then like an inflection point where people start to kind of realize it. I mean, as I said, we're already seeing huge pressures on the NHS because of increased demand. We're already seeing the growth in things like disability payments kicking in, and that's all leading to potentially savings being made, elsewhere in the budget. And we did some analysis into the budget for this year that is once you account for social security and inflation, the day-to-day budget of the Scottish Government is actually going down. And that's before you start to think about the NHS. So it means that other budgets are going to have to get saved elsewhere. I guess at what point do people notice that? I think will be the point where it gets to the kind of savings you're making really starts to bite through into what people are expecting. And at what point that happens, I think is kind of a bit uncertain. The point I'd say though is that the next 25 years are particularly challenging for Scotland, and that might be the point that you start to see it kick in. So that's why there's a real leadership question in many ways, because the general public will not go in, as much as I'd like them to read our 120-page report. I know they probably won't. So the question is, how do leaders, basically political leaders, see this coming and make the decisions and start having that really honest conversation and move away from annual budgets, propping up money here, press release there, to actually be front up and say, this is what we need to do in order to essentially maintain the public services that we depend upon.
That's the dream, that leadership. I'm sure it will arrive at any point now. Okay, David Belful.
Well, Graeme, I wish you success in getting the politicians to address these long-term issues. They're very much focused on short-term issues and what the next election holds. And bearing in mind that older people are much more likely to vote than younger people, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to get the mainstream parties actually to address these issues, or to get them to bring forward and have an honest conversation with the electorate about this. But my question was really that we really have two problems here. One is the growing elderly population, and then, at least post-COVID, the shrinking working age active population. People either on benefits or not active for other reasons. And the consequences of that are, if they're on benefits, there's additional expenditure, the tax take is reduced, and the need for immigration is greater. So I was wondering, in relation to that second area about the active working population, whether you have any projections about what is going to happen to that. Do you think this is largely the results of COVID, which will work out in due course, or do you think it's going to increase over the longer term?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my honest answer to that is we don't yet know about what the potential long-term trends in that. So what we do in our report, again, just for kind of transparency, is we essentially take the status quo at the moment and just push it forward, and then say, okay, there's risks around that. But you're right. I mean, I think one of the things which I think is really, and it's not really been spoken about, I don't think, too much in terms of the policy debate, is exactly this kind of, particularly post-COVID. It was happening pre-COVID, but this big inflow into into disability payments and what's driving that, and particularly amongst young people. I mean, the inflows into child disability payments in Scotland and child disability allowance in the UK are really quite staggering. Coming through, particularly around well-being and mental health concerns. And we can see the trends, and we can say, look what's happening here. This huge inflow of people going on to these payments, and the concern being, if you're going on to these disability payments in a young age, then you stay on these payments over the long term. So we can see it and we can highlight it and say, well, this is a real concern. And I think there's a consensus that it's a trend, so it's not a blip. There is a consensus this is actually a trend, and it's not something that will just disappear post-COVID. What is actually driving that? So is this a reduction in stigma and a bit greater awareness of this, so people are now approaching that? Or is it linked to things like social media, COVID effects, broader challenges within society? If all of these elements are actually much more structural, then there's a real concern about what this particularly means. And it matters for the Scottish budget. As I mentioned, we haven't spoken about it, but on the social security side of things, where that is now in the Scottish Government's remit, and any additional inflows relative to the rest of the UK is money that the Scottish Government has to pay for and find from somewhere. So I think it's not a great answer to your question, other than to say I think it's probably more of a trend than something that's a short-term blip, but we don't fully understand what is driving that trend.
Thanks for that, David. That was a great question. Kevin Pringle. Kevin.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Graeme. Just a quick one, really, but figures have shown that, I think you mentioned a bit earlier, through the 20th century, Scotland has traditionally been a net, if you like, exporter of people to the rest of the UK, to the rest of the world. It's almost, become part of our culture, if you like. But I think it was round about the millennium when that sort of reversed.
Yeah.
Both in regard to the rest of the UK and the wider world. So I just really wondered if you had any thoughts about what factors played a role in sort of reversing that, and I suppose what more can be done to encourage it, given the sorts of pressures you've outlined. Not that it can ever be the answer, but
yeah,
a small perhaps part of the answer.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, Scotland. I mean, Michael Anderson, colleague at Edinburgh University, done brilliant work on Scotland's population over the years, and he's got some brilliant facts about how Scotland was one of the very few countries, if the only country in Western Europe that didn't have growth in its population through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we were exporting people, and that's one of the legacies that we face. That's the reason why we're aging earlier, is because of this bulge. The baby boomers are just going through the system, but there's fewer people coming behind because we had that out migration, and that's what's one of the big legacy effects. And then you're right, the accession countries and the growth in the early 2000s has led to that turnaround, and also migration from the rest of the UK, I think, is important. It's not always been at the working age population, but we have seen increased migration from the rest of the UK coming in to do that. And a couple of caveats I would say about that. So the first thing is that migration can certainly help, and I don't want to kind of leave the impression that migration isn't potentially a really positive thing for the Scottish economy, particularly in sectors, particularly, helping to tackle some of the fiscal issues, etc. over time. I said there is this quirk in the system that because it's all about our tax performance per head, we don't get the automatic benefit of bigger population than you might do if you were under a different fiscal arrangement. And also as well, we're still talking about relatively small numbers. So we're still talking about, 20,000, my net positive international migration for Scotland each year. That's against a population of nearly 5.5 million. So it can impact the growth rates at the margin, but it's not going to fundamentally change the stock of our population unless we had, migration on a scale that we've never really seen before. Ultimately, I mean, what attracts migrants is it's pretty simple, and it's pretty well evidenced, which is high quality jobs, good public services, there's not really much more than that because it comes down to have you got a job, have you got a house, are you getting good public services, and that's the thing that attracts good migrants.
Okay, thanks for that question, Kevin. We don't have lots of time left, but we don't have time for everybody's question. There's a couple that have caught my eye though that just before we finish. So, Paul McGuinness, Paul, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I guess thanks for the presentation, Graeme. My question was really around how have potential productivity improvements in public sector delivery and I guess specifically healthcare delivery through advances in technology and adoption of AI. How has that been factored into this analysis? And I guess a follow up to that, I guess I'm aware of this kind of term, the ball maul. I think there's a ball maul effect within. It's often applied to public sector. If that was reversed through, better use of technology and AI, would that allow spending to grow at a slower rate and alleviate some of these pressures you're referring to?
Yeah, so that's great. So to explain, the Baumol effect is essentially this evidence that is clear, and it's not a Scottish thing; it's across all countries. In that, essentially, productivity in the healthcare sector is really difficult to get. And actually, as you have new technologies, as you have new ways of working, etc., what that actually does is add to the costs of healthcare rather than actually make savings. So if you detect illnesses earlier because you've had a productivity improvement and you've got a more efficient system, the question then becomes, well, how do you treat these illnesses? So all that happens is you just actually make a saving or you make an improvement in detecting something, but it builds in a cost further down the line. So, and that's the kind of Baumol effect and all of that. I mean, again, so this is where I think we talk about in a report where you can talk about there's kind of cost saving technological improvements and savings there. So how can you potentially make things more efficient, things like, apps to access services, things like improvements to efficiencies for booking GP appointments, all those sorts of things potentially can save quite a big bit of resource. But also we know that technological improvements will actually lead to potentially more costs. So a new drug that can treat a particular disease that might be very expensive. So once that comes into the system, you could potentially do it. So I think, again, this comes back to the solution to all of this is multifaceted between a mixture of a debate about what is prioritization, how do we reduce the demand on healthcare over the lifetime through improved healthy life expectancy, but also then how can we actually run things more efficiently and more effectively within the healthcare system? And all of these effects need to be addressed.
Okay, and we're almost out of time, but I would like to just squeeze in one last question if I can. Neil Stewart, Neil, are you with us?
Yes, thank you for taking the question. It was just to maybe touch quickly on the sort of regional trends, across the country. Glasgow, for example, after a long time of decline, its population is now growing, and we're having to worry about things like opening primary schools after a long time of thinking about shutting them. There's not really been much of a debate in Scotland, I guess, about in terms of cities and towns as there has been in England. But, we know that cities drive growth and the public goods that exist in cities are the things that attract migrants, etc. So are there opportunities to sort of lean into that sort of demographic change in the sort of regional and sub-regional basis? can maybe given more autonomy to cities and the regions around them. I'm just really thinking about, I guess, the sort of traditional dynamic of Glasgow's suburbs being wealthier, but that may sort of begin to reverse as the city becomes younger and the suburbs age a lot quicker, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we don't go into detail on about the regional piece or the local government piece, largely because we focus at a national level. But I think that that's a really interesting part, which I guess we do allude to that a wee bit in our report, where we say, look, actually, this population dynamics we're seeing are not the same across all health boards, and you will get big growth in some areas where the population is younger or migration will go into relative to other areas, and that opens up a whole challenge in its own right there about how you manage that. And I think you're right. One of the solutions, again, to all of this is understanding not just the demographic projections at a national level, but at a regional level as well. You mentioned, the cities. Again, for example, parts of the Highlands, again, you're seeing as well, migration needed into there for key sectors, the green industries, renewables, etc. And how do you manage all of that? And how do you manage areas where you've got to decline some public services but grow some public services in other areas? So the whole thorny kind of regional local government distributional analysis within all of this, which needs to be taken into account as well.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Graeme, and I think we'd all say more power to your elbow as the time goes on. You're doing your bit. The question is, will the politicians do their bit? At the very least, they won't be able to say that they weren't warned repeatedly by you and Audit Scotland and us and others. But it's really fascinating to hear this evidenced projection into the future of the challenges that we face. And I think the more we talk about it, perhaps it becomes a bit more likely that we'll try to get to grips with it on a scale that matches it. And thank you, Graeme, for your time, and thank you to everyone for coming along. Thank you for some excellent questions as well. And we shall see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.